Hi everyone, good afternoon, Prynawn Da, and welcome back to the Cymorth Cymru Housing First Wales Conference 2022. I hope you've enjoyed our sessions this morning. I certainly found them really thought-provoking and learnt lots from our speakers so far, and I'm sure that will be the same for this session. So this session's all about the concept of graduation. And so we know that a key principle of Housing First is that support should not be time limited. But what happens when someone reaches a point where they feel they don't need the support anymore? In some parts of the world, there have been discussions about graduation from Housing First, with some arguing that this is a positive outcome, while others have warned against the risks of ending support too soon. We're going to be discussing this issue with Alex Smith from Homeless Link, Ruth Watling from Homeless Network Scotland, and Joe Parry from Wales's longest running Housing First project, by the Wallet. So I'd like to welcome Ruth, Alex and Joe to join me on screen for this discussion. Please everyone feel free to submit questions via the Q&A panel and we'll do our best to answer those as we move through the discussion. Thank you so much to all of you for being with us today. It's going to be a really interesting discussion and really fascinated to hear your perspectives from different parts of the UK and also from Joe, who's been running this service for a long time. So firstly, if I could go to Alex, how has the conversation about, I guess, what we're terming graduation been progressing over in England? Are people discussing it, or are some actually, using it and putting it into practice? And what's the kind of general view on it over in England?
Hi, Katie. Thanks. Yes, I think probably useful just to start with the research that we published last year. So we looked at this question of reducing, changing or ending Housing First support. And that covered quite a broad range of transitions. So thinking about kind of death and dying, thinking about prison release, about moving to alternative accommodation, but also this question of reducing support and maybe when support is no longer needed. So I thought I'll start there. I'm happy to share the link to the research for anyone who's interested. But I think some of the headlines from that was, I think over 30 services responded, and I think almost 800 individuals kind of thinking about their journeys in Housing First, and only about 6% had graduated from a Housing First service. I think that's kind of caveated as well in terms of there not being a common definition around graduation and what that actually means. So some people that might be a kind of dormancy stage, for others it might be closure and not having any contact with the service. But I think overall it does show that graduation from Housing First is quite low in England, however we define it. And I think one of the key kind of takeaways from that research was, I think, as you mentioned in that introduction, that graduation shouldn't be seen as a service goal, a kind of point that we should be reaching, and that success shouldn't be measured in moving on from Housing First, but actually the stickability of Housing First and how well we've managed to engage with individuals that have been referred onto the programme. But I think it's also important to remember that Housing First is person-led, and that means that it might be right for some people that they no longer need that intensity of support. And I think one of the really interesting things from the research was that of that 6% who had graduated, it tended to be for younger people. And I think something that was coming out there was around kind of aspirations for training, employment, establishing new relationships, and really wanting to kind of move away from being in services and starting kind of a new life. Whereas maybe that isn't always the case for other people. And I think thinking about the thresholds for coming into Housing First, we set them very high. So we're really kind of working with the most excluded and people that are really experiencing that very severe multiple disadvantage. And I think the distance travelled in Housing First is really important. So even when we see kind of periods of stability and people doing quite well, I think we need to take that in the context of other support needs, and actually support needs still remain quite high in comparison to the general population, even when things have improved a good bit for people, and that stability can often be quite fragile. So it doesn't take a lot to kind of knock somebody and for support to be kind of needed again. So I think that becomes a really difficult question around graduation about you know, when we would do that, what's right for that individual. And I think maybe it's not as useful thinking about graduation as is thinking about kind of fluctuating need and thinking about how Housing First fits into that wider system, so that we can offer kind of step up and step down as people need it at different points. So that was a few initial reflections from England. I hope my internet is holding out okay and you're catching everything.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, it's holding out okay at the moment. Thank you for those fascinating insights, and really interesting to hear about the research, and we're very happy to share that with attendees after the conference. Ruth, I wondered whether you had any reflections from Scotland about whether the concept of graduation has been talked about at all, and what the response has been maybe in services, and whether they're kind of thinking about it positively, negatively, or not at all.
Absolutely, it's a very live discussion. I think it's interesting, in Scotland we don't use the term graduation. We talk about step down or stand down. We're not using the same terms that are being used elsewhere in the UK. Just to start with, I wanted to just give a bit of context, I suppose. Housing First in Scotland is live in 27 local authorities. 6 of them are the Pathfinder local authorities, so it started in 2019 officially, but some areas it started earlier. And we're currently conducting a checkup process with 13 local authorities who have been delivering Housing First for more than a year, but not part of the Pathfinder. So Housing First hasn't been delivered for a hugely long time in Scotland in a number of areas. And I think, as Alex was just saying, some local authorities have explicitly chosen to work with their very most vulnerable and complex households and people in their areas. So the acknowledgement that they're going to need support at a high intensity level for a long time. But there's some things that local authorities have said work really well in terms of stepping down or reducing the high intensity support, which are really around relationships, knowing people, communicating, like really clear, open communication, and creating a way of understanding early when support needs are likely to be increasing again, if they have started to go into the step down or stand down process. Most local authorities, though, are not explicitly setting up processes that they're calling step down or stand down. They're not sure how to do it. They're looking, they're responding very flexibly to what support needs people have, but they're looking for guidance. They're looking for, you know, more kind of operational information as to what this might look like and how it will fit with the principles still, how to ensure that they're still adhering to the principles. And I think from a systems perspective, how to resource this is really tricky. How to resource for people who are kind of leaving Housing First, going into maybe more mainstream services, but may come back at any point. And that's a massive question for local authorities in Scotland.
Thanks very much, Ruth. That's fascinating. Jo, you know, we've said earlier that you're the longest running project in Wales, established in 2013. And I know during the accreditation process we spoke, and the data collection process, we spoke about people who, you know, came into the project many years ago and actually, you know, don't really have any, you know, need any of that support anymore. But as far as I'm aware, you've not used the kind of concept of graduation, but you're kind of available as a service for people if they do have a spike in support needs going forward. Is that the approach that you take on the island?
Sorry, yeah, absolutely. I think that quite possibly when we started back in 2013, I think that was probably pre-principles, and we were kind of talking initially that although it wasn't a hard and fast rule that it was 2 years support, through the Supporting People grant at that time, it was 2 years support, but with the caveat that if somebody needed longer, you know, ongoing support, then case by case we could approach and they could continue to receive that support. So we've kind of never talked about it in terms of graduation, and, you know, which I think the language that we use, whether it's exiting the project, moving on from the project. But I think that's one thing that the accreditation did, was highlight the way in which something is said, which can have or make a massive difference to the perception, you know, of the service users. So I think we have to be really careful, because initially if we talked about moving on, they saw it as support ending or moving on from maybe the tenancy, when in actual fact we meant we're moving on, not you moving on, you know. So I think it was really kind of quite important, and it's just something that I suppose has evolved, and over the 9.5 going on 10 years that we've been now operating the service, it's just knowing that we never really, so people obviously graduate and do move on from the service. They may stay in that tenancy, as lots of people have. Some of them we don't hear from, a lot of them dip in and out. So I think the key for the people certainly that we've supported is knowing that that support never goes, that we never leave, that the door is always open, and that they can ring at any time. And it somehow makes that transition or graduation easier for people, knowing that actually it's very much led by them. You know, it's totally person-centered, it's led by them, it's not time limited. And we usually find that, you know, people will move on for many reasons from wanting that intensive support, you know.
Thanks, Jo. And yeah, I think that kind of, all three of you have emphasised that importance of the kind of client perspective and choice being at the heart of this, and certainly about when people have aspirations, being able to kind of encourage and support those, but always be there as a safety net. You know, making sure that the support is there if they do hit a kind of hiccup in the road. Alex, I was really interested in the things that you said about, you know, the aspirations, and particularly for young people, that the concept of graduation actually could be quite a positive thing that could help someone to kind of set those aspirations and look to the future. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, isn't it, this term graduation, and whether or not it is the right kind of terminology. I think it does make me think of it being a kind of service goal, because I think there is a kind of sense of wanting to achieve a graduation, and that being that sign of success that we've kind of reached that point. And I think on the kind of opposite side of that, it's almost, if you don't graduate, then that's a failure of either you as an individual or as the service. So I think there's something about changing that to it being what's right for that individual, and us being a really person-led service that can meet the needs of that individual. And I think, yeah, for For younger people, I think that is, you know, with any research, it probably brings up more questions than it does answer, because, you know, we didn't get to kind of delve into the specifics of what that meant for younger people. But I think what we do know, obviously, is that Housing First for youth is different to Housing First for over 25s, and we deliver that in a different way in terms of, you know, what does a permanent house mean? You know, what does support for as long as is needed mean for a young person who's still developing and having that kind of youth focus? So I think maybe, you know, it would be right to talk about graduation, or however we term it, in different ways for Housing First for youth compared to Housing First for over 25s. And I think that's probably an area to explore more.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And we certainly have a Housing First for Youth subgroup as part of our Housing First Wales network. So certainly something for them to consider over the coming weeks and months. Excuse me. I think you're right. I think the term graduation does imply success, and therefore we do need to be really concerned about the possibility of people within Housing First who don't move on feeling that that is interpreted as some kind of failure on their part. You know, we all understand the amount of trauma that many people using Housing First have been through, and it's really, really important that we don't inadvertently use language, you know, as Joe said, that kind of creates any stigma or creates any judgment or perception about success or failure. So I think that's a really important point as well. In terms of some of the challenges, I'd be really interested, you know, in any other reflections, because you know, there's been a few articles and bits of research published internationally that have talked about worrying about the impact that this could have on commissioners' perceptions of projects, and whether, you know, we know we're in a time of scant resources within public funding. We know that there is more demand on the system than we maybe have capacity to deal with it, and potentially that, you know, if the concept of graduation takes off, that there potentially becomes pressure on projects to move people as quickly as possible to that point, because the funder or commissioner sees that as a goal. And would you, Ruth or Alex, kind of have concerns about that having that unintended consequence if this concept of graduation was taken forward?
I think it's. I can start, Alex. I'm sure you'll have other things to add. I think it's a balance, as many of these things are. That it's important for people to know that they have support for as long as they need it. That's an absolutely essential part of Housing First. However, moving forward and creating a life that people are looking for, or that they're aspiring to, is also important. So for me, I think local authorities in Scotland would really welcome something that was more clear about what we should be aiming for. However, I think that does bring with it some concerns and dangers, both for people that are going through the Housing First process that are tenants, but also, I agree, from the funding perspective, we already have, we've been talking to a number of providers, particularly third sector providers in Scotland, who are already really nervous about, I'm telling people that I'm going to be here for as long as they need it, but I've only got funding until next March. And that's already a real concern in terms of the way that the support provision is commissioned. And if we then kind of put something around it, which could be misinterpreted as being this is a time limited offer, then it would be really helpful to commissioners to be able to say, right, we'll just provide that for 2 years. And maybe it's a little bit cynical of me, but I do think that we need to be cautious about putting specifics onto how long support is available for, when we know that what works in Housing First is not doing that.
Absolutely, 100% agree with that, Ruth, for sure. And it's a really important part of the principles that we all advocate in our respective nations. And it's certainly something that, you know, the Welsh Government is very clear about, but probably requires in each of our nations that leadership, whether it be from, you know, the devolved government, the UK government or local government, to kind of say to providers that, yes, we need to go through procurement and commissioning processes due to procurement roles, but actually from a strategic perspective, we are committed to housing first for the long term, and therefore funding will continue to be available, you know, despite the fact that commissioning processes might need to happen. So I think that's a really important point about leadership, to try and give that added security to projects and services. Alex, did you have any thoughts on the issue around, you know, commissioners and potential pressure on services to move people through if we talk too much about graduation?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we were concerned with that when we were commissioning the research as well. And I think interesting what you were saying, Joe, about that language of move on, because I think we'd originally been thinking about move on when we were thinking about the research, and very quickly kind of wanted to get away from that language that feels very much attached to a traditional kind of staircase kind of model. And I think, you know, when we have our commissioners embarking on Housing First, I think we need them to be brave, and we need them to fully embrace the principles, which means thinking a little bit differently. So I don't think it is very helpful kind of leading with a conversation on graduation. And I think that point again of it being kind of a service goal isn't helpful and isn't realistic. And I think that's what we're seeing with the 3 big regional pilots in England. The graduation rates are very low, and that further funding is needed in order to continue the support and to maintain what's already been started and offered for people. And I think for some of our longer term projects, I'm thinking particularly about Camden Housing First that started in 2010. They've continued to scale up their provision and have gone from a small pilot of just, you know, 5 residents up to now 72. And they've done that by committing to the original cohorts and sustaining what they've offered whilst adding to and enabling that scale up. So I think that's the kind of the different kind of commissioning that we need for Housing First, is both sustaining what we started and also scaling up, rather than thinking about where are the efficiencies, how can we get more people through the door, and which inevitably leads to higher caseloads and a real impact on fidelity. And I think the final point is just, I think there's something in our sector that we are kind of, you know, fixated on homelessness being a transient thing, and it should be, you know, it should be brief and non-reoccurring, and people should be able to move out of homelessness. But what we're talking with Housing First isn't just a homelessness issue. We're talking about people that have got a really broad spectrum of health and social care needs that are coming into Housing First with very complex needs. And I think when we think about things from a social care perspective, we accept that some people need support for an indefinite length of time if they have learning disabilities or they're older people. And I think we need a bit of a shift in our thinking about multiple disadvantage from that perspective as well, that it isn't a case that we have to get to an end point, that actually ongoing support is okay, and we accept that in other sectors, and that actually maybe we need more of that for Housing First.
Thanks very much, Alex. Really, really interesting points. Just a reminder to people that you can submit questions through the Q&A. Joe, I was reflecting as Alex was talking then about that relationship with commissioners and the need to have that strategic support. Not only, I think, as you've talked about earlier today, about the understanding of the principles, I think, you know, if the commissioners don't understand the concepts around, you know, not being time limited, etc., then you're going to be struggling. So I think, you know, you've got a relationship with the commissioner who does understand Housing First, and you work really hard with them to do that. And you also are kind of engaged in conversations about being able to scale up. Could you tell us a bit more about the relationship with the commissioners on those issues, on the understanding of the principles, but also the need, you know, to scale up if you're going to take on more people in the project?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from when we initially started, again, you know, 9 years ago now, it was small, and we've grown in numbers. We're still not, you know, huge numbers, but we have grown from where we initially started. I think the commissioners that we've got locally are really good at listening to, you know, to us. It's a two-way thing. So there's an understanding from them that they know what they're asking us to do, but they'll say, but, you know, kind of right back at you, explain what it is you need us to do, you know. So I think having that two-way kind of relationship is really important. They are really good at, you know, we do revisit occasionally the criteria, and because we know we support, you know, people with the most complex of needs. So occasionally, you know, somebody might come through that perhaps isn't suitable for the service, so that doesn't happen often. And I think it's just about, like I said, revisiting the needs of the project and also their expectations of us, you know. So obviously with the development of the principles, and we now work to those, there isn't the same kind of issues around time. And, you know, we've got a service user at the moment that's been with us for considerable time, based a lot around kind of health and care needs, but you know, he's still there and he's still with us, and they're understanding of that, you know. So yeah, on the whole, you know, we do have a good relationship. But I think, I'm not sure whether it was Alex or Ruth that said, but I think, you know, going forward, it would be nice to think that you didn't, not that we feel the need, but that you didn't feel the need to have to justify that kind of long-term ongoing support, because some people always need it, even if it's dipping in and out or a bit more low level, you know.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jo, for that insight from Anglesey. So it feels like we've talked a little bit about terminology here, and I'm kind of getting the sense that a number of you feel that we shouldn't be using the term graduation. Alex, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan. I think for some of the reasons that I've said, in terms of it seeming like it's an achievement, that it's a success, that it's a goal to get to. I think it would be much more helpful to talk about people not needing intensive support any longer. And if we think about Housing First being part of that kind of broader housing-led system, and Housing First really being sort of defined by the intensity of the support that's offered, that actually people, you know, there's a spectrum of support that can be available, and it's not a kind of in or out. It's, you're either Housing First or you're absolutely, you know, flying and you don't need anything. That actually, if you don't need intensive support, that you might need some kind of support. And that's not to say that Housing First don't have a role, because we know the importance of that relationship. So I think, as Ruth was talking about, the tricky thing is really about how do we value that ongoing relationship, but also how do we try to kind of be sensible about the capacity of the service and looking to kind of take new referrals in. And this goes slightly off what you've asked, Katie, but I just wanted to mention, I think we probably need to be talking more about the role of peer mentors in Housing First, and how we can, I think, maintain that connection with people, how we can do the work of, you know, what do we mean by graduating? And I think there's something there about the community integration work, about people feeling like they've got, you know, friendships or relationships with family, that they've got some sense of connection to their community, some sense of purpose. I think that's at the point that Housing First is no longer really needed, because we've got somewhere that we can go to, you know, just like you or I have, we've got people that we can go to, that we can trust, that we can rely on outside of paid support workers. And I think peer mentors play a really huge role with that. So thinking about kind of those latter stages in the evolution of Housing First, that actually maybe be thinking it's all on the Housing First workers' shoulders, that we can have a slightly different offer at a later stage for people, and what that might look like.
Brilliant, thanks Alex, and very much welcome going off on tangents in this discussion. That's where we get some of the best points being made. Ruth, your feelings on the terminology around graduation?
I was saying before, we don't use the terminology. It almost feels like, I think we've not gone down the accreditation route either in Scotland as yet. That might change over time. It feels like it's formalising things in a way that isn't necessary. The fidelity with the principles is absolutely necessary, but I think setting up particularly tenants to kind of pass or fail something doesn't feel like it's within the principles really of Housing First. But what the terminology that we use, and I'm just reflecting on what Joe was saying about what they use, which is move on, and how that sounds maybe more positive than what we use, step down and stand down, which is about the service. It's not about the individual. So I think this is something that I'm going to take back to partners actually and talk a little bit more about. I've not been involved in Housing First for nearly as long as anyone else on the screen, so I'm not sure of the history of how we've come to these decisions. So, but it's something that I'm really keen that we explore a bit more.
Thanks very much, Ruth. And I think, a lot of this has been quite organic. I think, people haven't necessarily taken decisions about language. Some creeps in from international examples of practice, and then we think, oh goodness, what's that, and should we be talking about it and thinking about it? But I think it's really interesting that there seems to be this consensus that graduation isn't the right terminology, and I wonder whether there's something that we can do across the three nations to think about consistency of terminology. And we don't necessarily have to do everything in the same way and use exactly the same terminology, but it feels like we're coming from very, very similar places and very similar values when it comes to this discussion. So potentially something for us to follow up on. I'm interested in, I guess, the concept of dormancy. So, Alex talked earlier about, there's various interpretations of what graduation may or may not be. And some might interpret it as an end to support, and that's closed and that's final. And, if the person did need support, they would have to go elsewhere or come back through the system. But the other thing that Alex mentioned was about someone becoming, I guess, a dormant kind of client of Housing First, in that they may not need that support at the moment. But if an issue arose in their life where they kind of hit one of those kind of crisis points, that they could reconnect with the service and pick up the support where they left off, really. And I guess, Alex, you mentioned the value of relationships there. People often have had really bad experiences of systems and really bad experiences of public services that have led to them, through their childhood and adulthood, falling into homelessness. And I guess one of the things about Housing First is you build that really close, trusting relationship with people. And so it almost, has much more of an important role in people's lives when they've been through Housing First. So, Joe, I wondered whether you could maybe reflect on how you kind of handle things at the moment. I know you briefly touched on this earlier, but, when someone does reach that point where maybe they feel that they don't need as intensive support or maybe any support for the foreseeable future, how do those kind of conversations take place between the client and the support worker? And then, how does that then reactivate if the person enters a bit of a crisis or feels they need to re-engage? And how do you manage that in terms of caseload as well?
I think people don't, most of the people we support, unless there really is non-engagement and they've decided they just don't want the support, then I think really most people start, it becomes apparent maybe through what they're achieving or what they're, how they're, the intensity might have dropped off. It might have initially been daily, and you now might be at a point where it's every other day or weekly, you know. So it's I hate to use the term because we don't use graduation, but it's a gradual process to kind of that support or them moving on from needing us in the same intensive way that they did, you know. When we come to a point of closure, and I'm talking about moving on from, because obviously, although that we've got that open door, you know, they know that they can come back at any point, but obviously they might not be open and active on our system. So I think, you know, for some people, when we do eventually close somebody, they're closed knowing that at any point they can call in, phone us, they can come back, you know, if they need that support. And I think that that's, you know, really key. We've just recently, just to give an example, had somebody that came back around who had moved on successfully. He had decided he no longer needed our support. He'd been with us for probably 12 months. Everything was, you know, life was good. But then sadly, through no fault of his own, hours were reduced at work, etc., etc. He got behind with his rent. And he recently came back to us. And we've been able to resolve it with him, which, you know, is really, really positive for him. And we were able to reopen him. The difficulty lies when perhaps, you know, numbers wise, you're full, and then somebody obviously comes back and they need more than, you know, short, sharp intervention. And I have to say at that point that staff may, because we work on roughly 5 to 7 per staff member. So it's never really created an issue where we can't reopen somebody, you know, but obviously that would be a conversation at that time because we wouldn't want to leave anybody without that support, you know.
Thanks, Jo. That's really, really useful insight into some of the kind of practicalities on the ground about how you manage that. Mm-hmm. And Alex, you know, you've mentioned dormancy, and I guess is that the sort of approach that you maybe see in England or would like to see in England, that, you know, that open door approach, that willingness to re-engage is there, but that organisations are supported to have the capacity to enable them to do that?
Yeah, I think dormancy is used quite a lot here in England, and not just in relation to kind of graduation or moving away from housing first support, but I think, you know, if people have gone to prison for a period, rehab, you know, some kind of break, I guess, in the normal kind of routine of support. So I think it is used. I think, as Jo has kind of really well explained, I think there are challenges around managing the caseload capacity for that. So I wonder about this idea of having a kind of dormancy caseload that sits alongside an active caseload, and whether or not we should be putting some numbers on that, if that would be helpful as a guide. But I think the challenge is then, if you've got, you know, your 7 active cases and then you've got, you know, say like 3 dormancy cases, if all 3 of them become active again, and then you've suddenly got a caseload of 10 that is really going to limit the amount of flexibility and the intensity of the support that you can provide, as well as the impact on the individual worker as well. So I think that kind of maybe comes down to the size of the service as well. Do you know, if you've got a really a big housing first team, like, you know, the 3 regional pilots that we have, and there's more flex about how we kind of move things around and shift and make things work for individuals, that isn't really afforded in smaller services where there's maybe just 1 or 2 workers. So there's maybe something there about kind of, you know, making it fit for your context as well, and how much flexibility is available given that restriction for some. Probably just, I wanted to mention that kind of on the back of the research, I think, as you've mentioned, Ruth, there has been a real ask in England for guidance around how to manage these transitions effectively and in a supportive way that meets with the principles. So we're working on guidance at the moment, and one of the trickiest things in writing that is about how to talk about this dormancy kind of caseload and whether or not we should be advocating for that. Again, kind of thinking from a commissioning perspective, if that's almost a bit of a kind of a way of trying to pile on higher caseloads for services, and whether that's the right kind of approach. So I think there are some really tricky questions with the dormancy. And yeah, there was just a really good practical point I heard in a conversation a week or so ago, just about, I think, the relationship and the importance of that one relationship, and actually maybe making sure that the resident has got a relationship with a couple of people on the team, so that affords a bit more flexibility. If someone, you know, has a bit more capacity to say, yeah, I could take on another case, or, you know, if that dormancy case has become active, that there is a bit more flexibility there. So yeah, it's some potential. Again, I think I'm thinking about kind of peer mentor, you know, this membership model idea where there's kind of connection, but maybe not part of the active caseload. I think we maybe need to think a bit more creatively about how we approach it.
Brilliant, thanks Alex. And there's some really kind of key practical issues there, and absolutely agree. We've certainly heard from a couple of projects that have gone through the accreditation about how they've actively tried to make sure that someone is not dependent on one support worker, whether, you know, whether that be kind of mitigating risk of that support worker leaving the organisation, or, you know, in this case, people coming back in the system and understanding who might have capacity. So I think that's a really useful practical tip for projects going forward. Ruth, do you have any reflections on the kind of issue of dormancy and managing that?
I don't have much to add to what others have said. I think in Scotland, we are looking to address this more explicitly than we have been doing. And as Alex and I was saying earlier, that people are looking for guidance on it. And I think one of the things that I wanted to pick up, I suppose, was that from doing the checkup process with local authorities and support organisations, the commitment of support workers is enormous, and the responsibility that people feel for the people that they're supporting is absolutely mind-blowing in terms of the commitment they have to those individuals that they're working with, and they feel responsible for their well-being because they're the person that is taking this seriously, that, you know, is their main contact. So I'm really interested in the idea of the kind of dormancy caseload and whether that is something that we can look at, because I'd just be concerned that if people then came back into the system, then their workers that they've been supported by before would again feel hugely responsible as an individual for making sure that they're receiving the support they need. And local authorities are already kind of concerned about how they balance the resources. Can I just ask Jo something quickly? Your caseload numbers that you've decided for being between 5 and 7, was that part of this kind of process? Was it about making sure that people could come back into the service?
So initially, it was literally just the criteria at the time when we were set up that each support worker would hold an average or about 5 service users. But obviously there is that realization that when somebody is really quite complex, 5 can feel enough and quite heavy. But then occasionally, as people go through the service and start to improve in whatever area they've been wanting to improve on, then their intensity of support by their choice may drop off. So it's just meant that rather than leave anybody out or be full or not be available, we've just found that it's an average probably of 6, but it can fluctuate between 5 and 7,
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Jo. And as Alex has said in the chat, various research does suggest that between 5 to 7 caseload is ideal. So that's what we tend to incorporate in the Housing First Wales accreditation process. That's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you to all three of you, but particular thanks to Ruth, who has stepped in at the last minute because her colleague was unwell. So you wouldn't have known at all, Ruth. You were absolutely fantastic and raised some really, really important points. But yeah, thank you to Ruth, thank you to Alex, and thank you to Joe. You've been absolutely fantastic today. I think we've got lots of things to think about going forward, and hopefully across the different nations we can come to some sort of consensus about this and work together to help kind of, you know, navigate through some of the tricky issues that come up from these conversations. So thank you all. That's it for this session, but we do hope that you'll join us for our next session, which starts at 1:30. That will be focused on the involvement of mental health and substance use services in the delivery of Housing First in Wales. We'll be hearing from our research officer, Gareth Lynn Montes, who will be talking about the 50 odd conversations he's had with Housing First projects, with clients, with mental health practitioners and substance use practitioners about how those services interrelate and how we can improve the join up strategically and improve services for people in Housing First. So thank you so much for all of your engagement, and we hope to see you at 1:30. Thank you to our panel, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.